So in this video, I want to take a look at a game that I played a few days ago. This was an over-the-board game. It was just a casual game. And my opponent played e4, e5, and knight c3, the Vienna game, which is not a move that I see very often. In fact, I almost never see this move. Not that it's a bad move, but because I almost never see it, I don't really know the theory of it. And so I just decided to play bishop c5. And my opponent played knight f3. I went d6. And after bishop c4, the second most popular move is knight f6. But apparently the best move is knight c6. And I found two games by very strong players. The first one was Alexander Morozovich against Vasily Ivanchuk, and the second one was some guy I've never heard of, rated almost 2500, against Michael Adams with the black pieces. But I played bishop e6. I just don't want this bishop to potentially sacrifice itself on the f7 square with ideas of knight g5. You can't play that obviously right now because, well, the black queen can just take it, but after the pawn moves to d3 or d4, then potentially there's the idea of those sacrifices. And, well, if my opponent decides to recapture, then I'm very happy because after I castle, the rook will have this semi-open file, and I will have a pawn center after I push the d-pawn. So my opponent decided to play d3, which is not a very good move because, well, it allows me to take the bishop and ruin the pawn structure, which is what I did. A better move was either to capture the bishop or to retreat, and if I take the bishop, well, then he can recapture, and now the rook is putting pressure on this pawn. So after recapturing, I played a6 because I didn't want knight a5 to capture my bishop. My opponent instead played knight d5, which is a nice outpost for the knight. The only problem with that is that I haven't played knight to c6, so I can play pawn to c6, kicking the knight back, and here my opponent just retreated. I think a better practical continuation would have been to put the knight on e3, because now the knight has ideas of coming to f5, and if I played g6, well, now I'm weakening the dark squares, and this bishop can no longer guard them by going to f8 and g7. So after knight retreating back, I just continue my development, knight to f6, and now castles. And here I didn't want to castle immediately, I just wanted to continue my development. So I went knight bd7, and here my opponent played a3, which at the time I didn't think it was a particularly good move, but the engine actually thinks that it's a decent move. I just like developing my pieces, so I would have played something like bishop g5 instead. And after a3, I went queen e7, and after b4, which I thought was the whole idea of a3, I just retreat, still putting pressure on the f2 pawn. And here my opponent blundered with knight a4, which just allows me to take the pawn. The engine here recommends queen d3, although I think activating the bishop, again with either bishop g5 or more likely bishop b2, would have been better. In fact, bishop b2 is probably what I would have played if I had white in this position. And well, knight a5 doesn't really do anything, and because, well, the squares are guarded and the knight is on the side of the board, which is not really helping the knight be as effective as it could be, not to mention the fact that it just leaves the e-pawn unprotected. So I took the pawn, and now my opponent made a second mistake. He played rook e1, and here I should have played bishop takes f2 check immediately, but I kind of like the position of my knight, so I just went f5. And here my opponent played b5. A much better defense was bishop e3, and if we trade, well, rook takes, and yes, okay, black is still up a pawn, and well, the computer is giving it as -2, which is a pretty big advantage, but it's only a pawn, and yes, you have double pawns. The knight here isn't impressing anyone, so black is clearly better, but this is by no means, time to resign. After b5, now I took on f2 with check, although there is this nice little trap with a takes b5, c takes b5, and now bishop takes. The point is that after the king moves and you capture the rook, well, there's this discovered attack, so after, say, queen takes, well, now you're just winning a lot of material. But I played this bishop check, and my opponent played king f1, and I took the rook, and here my opponent blundered again. Well, maybe blunder is too strong a word, maybe mistake would be better, but I mean, the game is already really bad. I mean, look at the evaluation. -5, I mean, that's more than a rook. But the reason I don't like knight takes on e1 is because it gives up control of the h4, and well, the bishop is controlling this square, but you have less control over the g5 square, and the knight, again, on the edge of the board is not very effective. So I took advantage of that immediately by playing queen h4 with the threat of queen f2, and here my opponent missed the mate and went knight f3, and I played queen f2 checkmate. Had my opponent captured in this position with the queen, well, then there is no queen h4, and the game would have continued. But even after queen h4, there's queen f3, and that stops the mate. I mean, this pawn is hanging, and the position is already objectively lost. There's also the threat of taking and then capturing the knight. So, yeah, white's position is already pretty hopeless, but at least it's better than hanging mate in one, which happens to all of us, especially in blitz time controls. So I hope that you learned something and that you liked the video. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.